Hey, what's up guys? Mark from SANDMARC here, and today I'm going to be comparing the R5 to the 5D Mark IV. Spoiler alert, the R5 is much better. Now, the R5 is considered by a lot of people to be essentially a game changer with this addition of 8K raw video to this tiny mirrorless camera. I mean, that's just insane. Prior to this, 8K was just not very accessible for a lot of people because it was only in really expensive cinema cameras. Now, this isn't the first time that Canon has done something like this that essentially changed the game when it comes to consumer products and professional products. They've done this with the 5D series on multiple occasions, and while the Mark IV isn't necessarily groundbreaking itself, it's part of a lineage that really did change the camera space, bringing us to where we are today. Now, when the original 5D came out, it had brought full frame photography to a lot of consumers that really weren't able to access it before. And then it did this again with the 5D Mark II, bringing HD video to a DSLR for the very first time, enabling independent filmmakers to be able to capture quality images in a very small and cheap profile. Now, getting into the specs on the photography side, both cameras feature the same size sensor, full frame, but the R5 has a much higher megapixel count at 45 megapixels compared to the 5D's 30 megapixels.
To illustrate the difference that 15 megapixels can make, I blew up these images from the Mark IV and the R5 quite a bit more than anyone should really ever have to, and I think it's very clear that the R5 is quite a bit cleaner than the Mark IV, which is great for if you need to recrop an image and you don't want to have to worry about losing too much of the quality, or for if you want to make some very large prints.
The R5 does continuous shutter at 20 frames per second, whereas the 5D can only do up to 7 frames per second. I think it's a very clear win for the R5 in that category. Now, another big feature for the R5 is its in-body stabilization, otherwise known as IBIS. Now, this is something that just doesn't exist in the Mark IV, and I think it's a clear, huge advantage for the R5. It makes shooting, especially at those lower shutter speeds, much easier handheld. Essentially, this means you're not gonna get any of that blur, shakiness when you're trying to shoot handheld at lower shutter speeds.
Alright, so looking at these two images overlooking the city, they were both shot handheld again at very low shutter speeds. And perhaps I just have the world's shakiest hands, but the 5D Mark IV looks significantly worse than the image I was able to capture handheld on the R5, just showing how good that built-in IBIS is. I must mention that the IBIS on the R5 isn't perfect. It appeared to me to be better at correcting whatever is at the center of focus than the edges of the frame, as you'll see in this photo.
Now, I gotta say, I was a little bit skeptical about the IBIS working very well for video, but I gotta say, I am blown away. It works very well. I don't think that it replaces a gimbal quite yet, but it is close enough to where you might consider whether or not you're gonna bring along that gimbal or if you're gonna try to do things handheld.
Moving further, looking at these video shots, I feel like I have to say that besides some minor coloring, there's no editing on these images. There's no warp stabilizer, there's no slow-mo. These are all shot in 24 frames per second, and the differences are clear. You can see for yourself.
That said, again, you still want to have as steady of a hand as you can, because if you try to rely on the IBIS too much, you'll start to get these weird wobbles on the edges, and it doesn't look very good. It looks pretty nasty, actually. Kind of that same effect that you'll get if you try to apply the warp stabilizer to footage that is really beyond savable. So you want to look out for that when it comes to video. Getting more into video, of course, the R5 shoots much higher resolution, up to 8K at 30 frames per second, 4K at 120 frames per second, and it just looks beautiful.
Now the R5 actually has two 4K modes. One is regular 4K, of course, and the other is 4K HQ, which is essentially just 8K scaled down to 4K in camera.
I think I'm lost. I went the wrong way, looking for the coffee shop, and I think I went the exact opposite direction. All right, here we go. Now the Mark IV, on the other hand, it also shoots in 4K, but only up to 30 frames per second. It does support 120 frames per second if slow motion is something that you care about, but it only does that at 720p.
Now comparing 4K to 4K, there's a couple things to consider. The 5D Mark IV has a significant crop factor, and you can really tell how much of the image you're losing when you compare it to the R5's image, which has an almost non-existing crop factor. The 5D Mark IV's 4K is also quite a bit softer than the R5's, which is much sharper and a bit more contrasty, if that's a word. And just to compare just how good the 4K HQ was on the R5, I compared that as well to the Mark IV's 4K, and I think the difference is clear. The 4K HQ, it looks so much sharper, so much better. It's amazing. Alright, so shooting these low light tests was pretty fun. I shot with the same lenses, largely the same settings and everything, and I think the difference, once again, is pretty clear. The R5 looks much better, especially once you start to get into those high ISO ranges. You can really see the difference between the R5 and the 5D Mark IV. Whereas the R5 is a much cleaner image with not too much noticeable noise compared to the 5D Mark IV, which has a ton of very noticeable noise, to the point that it looks pretty nasty and unusable. Even cranking the ISO up to the highest that it could possibly go, I think the R5 still fares pretty well. The noise doesn't look that bad in my opinion.
Ergonomically, I was pleasantly surprised at how good the R5 feels in the hand. This is something that I really didn't like in the past with a lot of mirrorless cameras. I felt like they were too small and a little flimsy, and they just didn't feel good in the hand to me. That's my experience with the Sony a7S II, and I expected that with the R5, but again, I was pleasantly surprised. It feels just as good, if not better, than the classic DSLR chassis of the 5D Mark IV. Now personally, I think the 5D Mark IV is very, very well built. It feels good in the hand, it feels sturdy, and I feel confident taking it out in a variety of situations. But again, the R5 feels really good as well. If you're switching over from the 5D Mark IV to the R5, you'll find that it's very, very familiar. It's a little different and it does take some getting used to, but I think that's a hurdle that you can get over fairly quickly. Now both cameras have two card slots. On the Mark IV, that's one for an SD card and one for a CFast card, whereas on the R5, one's for an SD again, but the other is for the new CFast Express. both cameras feature a 3.2-inch touchscreen display, which is great for tap to focus, but also just makes it a little bit easier to navigate the menus. But the R5 takes this a step further, adding something that I think all of us have been looking forward to, that flip out screen, which is great not just for vlogging, but also when you're shooting things at a low angle and you want to be able to see your monitor. Same goes for if you're shooting something from a higher angle and you're trying to operate from a lower angle. It's nice to be able to just turn that screen to be able to see what you're doing. Alright guys, I know we covered a lot and there's a lot more to cover still, but I gotta wrap things up. In sum, pretty much they're both really good cameras, and the one for you really depends on where your needs are as a creator. I personally prefer the R5, but again, they're both very, very good systems. Before you go, don't forget to like and subscribe. We're gonna be doing a lot more videos like this, doing more tests on the R5, and don't forget the iPhone 12 is around the corner if you guys have heard. And as absurd as it might be, we may even do a comparison between the iPhone 12 and the R5. So make sure you hit the like and subscribe button and ring that bell to be notified for when that comes so you guys don't miss a beat. As always, thanks for watching and happy shooting. Peace.